The static crackled through her headset as Maria Vasquez adjusted the frequency dial with practiced precision. Her weathered hands moved across the radio console in the pre-dawn darkness, the green glow of the displays casting shadows across her tired face. To everyone at Mountain View Air Station, she was just another voice in the background, the quiet woman who handled routine radio traffic and stayed out of the way. But in 12 hours, this overlooked veteran would use her forgotten expertise to guide a squadron of lost F-18 fighter jets through a deadly storm that would claim lives if not for her intervention. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Maria's workstation sat in the corner of the communication center, separated from the main air traffic control tower by a wall of bulletproof glass and decades of military hierarchy. Her console was older than most of the equipment around her, its black metal housing scarred by years of use and marked with faded warning labels that nobody bothered to read anymore. The setup looked obsolete compared to the sleek digital displays that dominated the primary control room. But Maria knew something that her younger colleagues had never learned. Sometimes the old ways were the only ways that worked. She'd been assigned to Mountain View for 8 months now, ever since her medical discharge from active duty. 22 years in the Air Force, including 3 combat deployments where her radio expertise had saved countless lives. And now she was filing routine weather reports and coordinating supply flights. Her military ID badge still read, Technical Sergeant, but everyone here called her radio support when they bothered to acknowledge her at all. The irony wasn't lost on her. During her time in Afghanistan, she'd been the communications lifeline for forward operating bases scattered across hostile territory. She'd guided rescue helicopters through sandstorms that grounded everything else, maintained contact with special operations teams deep behind enemy lines, and once spent 18 hours straight talking a damaged transport plane through a navigation system failure that should have been fatal. Her call sign had been Lighthouse, a beacon that guided others home when everything else went dark. But that was before the roadside bomb that shattered her left leg and ended her active duty career. Now she was just another civilian contractor, working the graveyard shift while the real air traffic controllers handled the important flights during normal hours. Her expertise in atmospheric radio propagation, frequency management, and emergency communications protocols gathered dust like the technical manuals stacked beside her console. Maria glanced at the weather display mounted above her workstation. A massive storm front was building over the Colorado Rockies, moving east toward the air station with unusual speed. The meteorological data showed atmospheric conditions that would create what radio operators called a black hole, a zone where normal communications became nearly impossible due to ionospheric interference and electromagnetic disturbance. She'd seen similar patterns during desert operations, when sandstorms carrying static electricity would blind radar systems and scramble radio frequencies across entire regions. The storm was still hours away, but Maria could already see the early signs in her equipment readings. Subtle fluctuations in signal strength, minor frequency drift, the kind of atmospheric disturbance that most operators would dismiss as routine interference. But Maria had learned to read these signs like a weather prophet, understanding that small changes often preceded massive disruptions. She reached for her logbook and began documenting the frequency anomalies, noting the specific patterns that indicated electromagnetic interference was building in the upper atmosphere. It was data that nobody would read, observations that no one had requested, but Maria recorded everything anyway. Old habits from a military career where attention to detail meant the difference between life and death. At 0400 hours, the first shift change brought Lieutenant Ryan Brooks into the communications center. He was young, confident, and carried himself with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never faced a real crisis. His college degree in aerospace engineering made him technically qualified for his position, but Maria had noticed that he struggled with anything outside standard procedures. "Morning, Maria," he said, settling into his chair at the primary control console. "Anything interesting on the overnight?" "Weather front building to the west," Maria replied, her voice neutral and professional. "Could affect communications later today. I've been tracking some unusual atmospheric readings." Brooks glanced at his weather display, which showed only basic meteorological data. "Looks normal to me. Just another spring storm." Maria almost pointed out the frequency analysis data she'd been collecting, the interference patterns that suggested this storm would be different from the routine weather they typically encountered. But she'd learned not to offer unsolicited technical advice. Brooks and his colleagues had made it clear that her job was to handle the routine traffic and leave the real decision-making to the qualified controllers. The morning briefing was scheduled for 0600 hours, and Maria knew better than to expect an invitation. She learned about flight operations the same way she learned about everything else at Mountain View, by listening to fragments of conversation, by reading duty rosters left on nearby desks, by piecing together operational details from radio. Chatter that others assumed she wasn't monitoring. Today's mission involved the 7th Fighter Squadron, 12 F-18 Super Hornets, conducting a training exercise over the eastern Colorado plains. The flight plan called for a 4-hour sortie, with multiple practice runs on ground targets before returning to base. It was routine training, the kind of mission that normally proceeded without complications, but Maria had spent enough years in military aviation to know that routine missions could become disasters when weather intervened. The storm front she'd been tracking was moving faster than the meteorological predictions suggested, and its electromagnetic signature indicated atmospheric conditions that would challenge even the most advanced navigation systems. She pulled up the flight schedule on her secondary monitor, noting the planned departure time and estimated return. The timing was problematic. If the storm maintained its current speed, the F-18s would be returning to base just as the atmospheric interference reached peak intensity. Standard radio navigation would become unreliable, GPS signals would degrade, and the sophisticated electronic systems that modern pilots depended on would face challenges they weren't trained to handle. Maria considered walking over to the primary control room to share her concerns, but she knew how that conversation would go. Brooks would listen politely, maybe even check the standard weather reports, but ultimately he'd rely on the same computerized forecasting systems that everyone else trusted. Systems that excelled at predicting conventional weather patterns, but often missed the subtle atmospheric conditions that affected radio communications. Instead, she returned to her console and began preparing her equipment for what she suspected would be a difficult day. She tested backup frequencies, verified the functionality of her emergency transceivers, and reviewed the technical specifications for the F-18's communication systems. If her predictions were correct, standard protocols would fail, and someone would need to provide alternative solutions. The irony was bitter but familiar. Maria possessed exactly the expertise that would be needed if the situation deteriorated, but she lacked the authority to act on her knowledge. She was the veteran with decades of experience in atmospheric communications, relegated to routine tasks while less experienced personnel made the critical decisions. As the sun rose over Mountain View Air Station, painting the control tower in golden light, Maria Vasquez settled in for what would become the longest and most important day of her civilian career. The storm was coming, the fighters would launch on schedule, and when conventional solutions failed, the forgotten expertise of the radio support operator would become the only thing standing between 12 pilots and disaster. She didn't know it yet, but in 6 hours, her voice would become the only connection between a squadron of lost fighter jets and the ground. Her knowledge of atmospheric radio propagation would prove more valuable than all the digital navigation systems in the Air Force inventory. and her willingness to break protocol would transform her from an invisible support contractor into the hero who brought everyone home. The morning briefing took place in Conference Room B, a sterile space filled with tactical displays and classification warnings that Maria could see through the glass partition but wasn't authorized to enter. Colonel David Richardson stood at the head of the table, his silver hair perfectly groomed despite the early hour, addressing the assembled pilots and control staff with the crisp efficiency of a career officer who'd never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through proper planning and execution. Maria remained at her console, monitoring the radio frequencies while the meeting proceeded 20 feet away. She could hear fragments of the briefing through the intercom system: weather reports, target coordinates, fuel calculations, but none of the discussion addressed the atmospheric conditions that were building in the storm front to the west. The meteorological briefing focused on wind speed and visibility, standard concerns for flight operations, but ignored the electromagnetic interference patterns that Maria had been tracking since before dawn. Captain Emma Stone led the pilot briefing, with the confident precision of someone who'd flown combat missions over 3 different continents. Her call sign was Mustang, and she commanded the respect of every pilot in the 7th Fighter Squadron. Maria had listened to enough of Stone's radio transmissions to recognize a professional who understood both the capabilities and limitations of her aircraft. But even experienced pilots could be caught off guard by atmospheric conditions they'd never encountered before. "Weather looks good for the exercise," Stone was saying, her voice carrying clearly through the intercom. "Scattered clouds over the target area, winds light and variable. We'll be operating in VFR conditions throughout the sortie." Visual flight rules meant the pilots would be relying on their ability to see and navigate by reference to the ground, supplemented by their electronic navigation systems. Under normal conditions, it was a perfectly safe approach for a training mission. But Maria knew that the approaching storm would create conditions where visual navigation became impossible and electronic systems would face interference that could render them unreliable. She studied the atmospheric data on her secondary monitor, watching the interference patterns intensify as the storm front continued its eastward movement. The electromagnetic signature was unusual, indicating high levels of static electricity in the upper atmosphere, combined with ionospheric disturbance that would affect radio wave propagation across multiple frequency bands. It was the kind of atmospheric phenomenon that occurred perhaps once every few years, and most controllers had never experienced anything like it. The briefing concluded with standard safety reminders and communication procedures. 12 F-18 Super Hornets would launch at 0800 hours, conduct training exercises over the designated range area, and return to base by 1200 hours. Each aircraft was equipped with multiple backup communication systems, GPS navigation, and emergency beacons. On paper, it was a routine mission with minimal risk factors, but Maria had learned during her military career that paper rarely survived contact with reality, especially when weather was involved. She'd seen too many routine missions become desperate rescue operations when atmospheric conditions exceeded the parameters that planners had anticipated. The difference between a successful sortie and a tragedy often came down to communication, the ability to maintain contact between aircraft and ground control when everything else failed. As the pilots filed out of the briefing room, Maria considered approaching Captain Stone directly. The squadron commander struck her as someone who might actually listen to concerns from an experienced operator, regardless of current duty assignment. But approaching a commissioned officer without going through proper channels could create problems for both of them, and Maria's civilian contractor status limited her authority to offer unsolicited advice. Instead, she decided to try the official route. Lieutenant Brooks was reviewing flight plans at his console, cross-referencing weather data with the planned route. He looked approachable, and his responsibility for air traffic control made him the logical person to receive her concerns about atmospheric interference. "Ryan," she said, walking over to his workstation, "I've been monitoring some unusual atmospheric readings. The storm front moving in from the west is showing electromagnetic signatures that could affect radio communications." Brooks looked up from his displays, his expression polite but dismissive. The weather briefing didn't mention any communication. "Concerns, standard storm, moving through by this afternoon." Maria pulled up her frequency analysis data on a portable tablet, showing him the interference patterns she'd been documenting. "These readings indicate ionospheric disturbance that could disrupt GPS signals and create dead zones for radio communication. The pilots might lose contact during their return flight." Brooks studied the data for a moment, but his expression suggested he was looking at something outside his area of expertise. The frequency analysis charts and atmospheric propagation models were specialized information that required years of experience to interpret correctly. "This looks like theoretical stuff," he said finally. "Our communication systems are designed to handle normal atmospheric interference. Plus, the birds have multiple backup systems." "I've seen similar patterns in combat zones," Maria persisted. "When atmospheric conditions reach these levels, even military-grade systems can be overwhelmed. The backup frequencies get jammed by the same interference that affects the primary channels." Brooks closed the tablet and handed it back to her, with a smile that was professionally courteous but clearly final. "I appreciate your concern, Maria, but we've got this covered." The Weather Service would have issued warnings if there was any real danger to flight operations. Maria returned to her console, feeling the familiar frustration of possessing knowledge that others didn't want to hear. The Weather Service warnings focused on conventional meteorological phenomena, wind, precipitation, temperature, but they rarely addressed the specialized atmospheric conditions that affected radio wave propagation. That kind of expertise resided with communicators like herself, veterans who'd learned through experience rather than textbooks. The storm front continued its relentless approach, and Maria's equipment registered increasing levels of electromagnetic interference. She documented every reading, knowing that the data would probably never be reviewed, but maintaining the professional standards that had defined her military career. If the situation deteriorated as she expected, her logs might be the only record of how the crisis developed. At 0745 hours, the first F-18s began their engine start procedures. Maria could hear the increasing radio chatter as pilots ran through their pre-flight checks, coordinated with ground control, and prepared for takeoff. The voices were relaxed, professional, indicative of aviators who expected a routine training mission. "Captain," Stone's voice cut through the radio traffic with calm authority. "Mountain View Tower, Mustang lead requesting taxi clearance for 12. F-18s, flight of 4, flight of 4, flight of 4. Mustang lead, Mountain View Tower, cleared to taxi to runway 27. Winds light and variable, altimeter 2992. Maria listened to the standard exchange while monitoring her atmospheric readings. The electromagnetic interference was intensifying faster than she'd anticipated, and the storm front was moving at nearly twice the speed predicted by the morning weather briefing. What had been scheduled as an afternoon weather event was going to arrive during the aircraft's planned return time. She reached for her radio handbook and began reviewing emergency communication procedures, the protocols designed for situations when normal systems failed. Most of the younger controllers had never studied these procedures, relying instead on computerized systems that automatically selected frequencies and managed communication traffic. But Maria remembered when radio operators had to understand atmospheric propagation, antenna theory, and frequency management at a fundamental level. The first F-18 lifted off at exactly 0800 hours, followed by the rest of the squadron in precise 4-ship formations. Maria watched their transponder signals disappear over the eastern horizon, carrying 12 experienced pilots into What she was increasingly certain would become a communications nightmare. She turned her attention back to the storm front, watching it build in intensity as it approached Mountain View Air Station. The electromagnetic readings were now showing interference levels that exceeded anything in her experience, and the atmospheric conditions were developing characteristics that would challenge every communication system on the base dot in 4 hours. Those F-18s would be trying to return home through a storm that would blind their navigation systems and silence their radios. And when that happened, Maria Vasquez would be the only person at Mountain View Air Station with the knowledge and experience necessary to guide them through the electromagnetic chaos. The question was whether anyone would listen to the radio support operator when the crisis began. The roar of 12 F-18 Super Hornets echoed across Mountain View Air Station as the 7th Fighter Squadron climbed into the morning sky. Maria watched their radar signatures on her secondary display, 12 bright dots moving eastward in perfect formation toward the training range. Captain Stone's voice crackled through the radio with crisp professionalism as she checked in with each 4-ship flight. Vol flight, radio check. Vol 2, loud and clear. Vol 3, 5x5. Vol 4, good copy. The ritual continued through Titan flight and Cobra flight, each pilot confirming strong radio contact with their flight leader. The communications were textbook perfect, exactly what you'd expect from an experienced squadron operating in ideal conditions. But Maria knew that ideal conditions were about to change dramatically. She monitored the squadron's frequency while simultaneously tracking the approaching storm front on her atmospheric analysis equipment. The electromagnetic interference was building steadily, though still below the threshold where it would affect standard military radio systems. To the pilots and controllers, everything seemed normal. But Maria could see the early signs of what was coming: subtle frequency shifts, minor signal degradation. The electronic equivalent of distant thunder before a lightning storm. At 0830 hours, the squadron reached their designated training area, a stretch of empty desert dotted with radar reflectors and practice targets. Captain Stone's tactical coordination was flawless as she divided the flights into separate attack formations, each group assigned to different target sets for their bombing runs. Mustang lead to all flights, time on target in 5 minutes. Weapons are simulated. Repeat, weapons are simulated. Stay sharp out there. Maria listened to the radio chatter with professional appreciation for the squadron's competence. These weren't rookie pilots fumbling through their first training mission. The 7th Fighter Squadron included combat veterans with thousands of flight hours, aviators who could handle their aircraft in any situation they'd been trained to encounter. But atmospheric interference wasn't something that appeared in standard flight training curricula. Lieutenant Brooks sat at the primary air traffic control position, monitoring the exercise with casual attention. His radar display showed the squadron's movements clearly, and his radio communications with the training range controller were routine and efficient. From his perspective, everything was proceeding according to plan, but Maria's specialized equipment told a different story. The atmospheric readings were showing increasing electromagnetic activity in the upper atmosphere, with interference patterns that were beginning to affect radio wave propagation at specific frequencies. The military communication systems were designed with enough redundancy to handle normal atmospheric interference, but the storm approaching from the west was creating conditions that exceeded normal parameters. She pulled up the technical specifications for the F-18's communication suite on her computer, reviewing the frequency ranges and power outputs for each system. The aircraft carried multiple radios, GPS receivers, and emergency beacons, all designed to provide reliable communication under combat conditions. But every system had limitations, and Maria had learned during her military career that even the most sophisticated equipment could be overwhelmed by severe atmospheric interference. The first bombing run commenced at 0845 hours, with Wolf Flight diving toward their assigned targets in a coordinated attack formation. Captain Stone's voice guided the exercise with tactical precision, calling out approach vectors and simulated weapon releases while maintaining awareness of all 12 aircraft in her command. Wolf Flight, cleared hot. Mustang, Tiger, target. In sight. Copy, Wolf Lead. Tiger rolling in. Good hit, Tiger. Wolf 3, you're cleared for your run. Maria admired the professional competence of the squadron, while simultaneously watching her atmospheric readings climb toward dangerous levels. The electromagnetic interference was now strong enough to create minor signal distortion on some frequencies, though not yet severe enough to disrupt the exercise. But the storm front was accelerating, moving toward the training area faster than any of the weather predictions had suggested. She checked the mission timeline against her storm tracking data and felt a chill of apprehension. The squadron was scheduled to complete their training and begin the return flight at 11:30 hours. According to her atmospheric analysis, that was exactly when the electromagnetic interference would reach peak intensity over the eastern Colorado plains. Maria considered calling the training range controller to share her concerns, but she knew that interrupting an active exercise without authorization would create serious problems for her civilian contractor status. Military communications protocols were strictly enforced, and unsolicited transmissions from support personnel could result in disciplinary action or loss of security clearance. Instead, she began preparing her equipment for what she increasingly believed would become an emergency situation. She tested her backup radio systems, verified the functionality of her emergency frequencies, and reviewed the technical procedures for atmospheric interference mitigation. If standard communications failed, someone would need to provide alternative solutions using older, more robust technology. The training exercise continued with military precision through the morning hours. Titan Flight completed their bombing runs with textbook accuracy, followed by Cobra Flight's successful attack on a different target set. Captain Stone's leadership was evident in every phase of the mission, her tactical decisions demonstrating the experience and competence that had earned her command of the squadron. Outstanding work, all flights, Stone transmitted as the final bombing run concluded. Reform on me for the return flight. Time to head home. Maria watched the 12 radar signatures converge into their return formation, knowing that they were flying directly toward atmospheric conditions that would challenge every communication system they carried. The storm front had accelerated beyond all predictions, and the electromagnetic interference was now reaching levels that would affect military RADIO equipment. She tried one more time to raise her concerns through official channels, walking over to Lieutenant Brooks's position with her latest atmospheric readings displayed on her tablet. Ryan, the storm's moving faster than predicted. The squadron's going to hit severe electromagnetic interference during their return flight. Brooks glanced at his weather display, which showed only basic meteorological data. I'm not seeing any severe weather warnings. The storm's still hours away, according to the forecast. The electromagnetic readings show interference levels that will disrupt radio communications, Maria insisted, showing him the frequency analysis data. This isn't about conventional weather. It's about atmospheric conditions that affect radio wave propagation. Brooks studied the data briefly, but his expression suggested he was looking at information outside his area of expertise. Maria, I appreciate your concern, but the squadron has multiple communication systems. Even if they lose primary radio contact, they've got GPS navigation and emergency beacons. GPS signals get disrupted by the same atmospheric conditions that affect radio, Maria explained. When ionospheric interference reaches these levels, even satellite communications become unreliable. Brooks returned her tablet with a polite but dismissive smile. The birds are equipped to handle any atmospheric conditions they're likely to encounter. Captain Stone has been flying F-18s for over a decade. She knows how to get her people home safely. Maria returned to her console with growing frustration and apprehension. She possessed exactly the expertise needed to prevent a potential disaster, but lacked the authority to act on her knowledge. The atmospheric conditions were building toward a perfect storm of electromagnetic interference, and 12 experienced pilots were flying directly into conditions that would challenge every system they depended on for navigation and communication. At 1100 hours, Captain Stone's voice crackled through the radio with the beginning of what should have been a routine return flight. Mountain View Tower, Mustang lead with 12 F-18s, requesting vectors for return to base. Mustang lead, Mountain View Tower. Fly heading 270. Descend and maintain flight level 240. Contact approach control on frequency 124.7. It was the last clear radio transmission the squadron would make for the next 6 hours. As the F-18s turned westward toward home, they flew directly into the leading edge of an electromagnetic storm that would test every skill they possessed and every system they carried. And when their sophisticated navigation equipment failed and their radio communications went silent, the only person at Mountain View Air Station with the knowledge to guide them home would be the overlooked veteran, whom everyone called just radio support. The first sign of trouble came at 11:15 hours, when Captain Stone's voice began breaking up over the radio frequency. What had been crystal clear communication just minutes earlier now carried the distinctive crackling distortion that Maria recognized as atmospheric interference affecting radio wave propagation. Mountain View. This is Mustang. Request updated. Heading for. The transmission dissolved into static, leaving Lieutenant Brooks staring at his radio console with growing concern. He tried to re-establish contact using standard procedures, switching to the backup frequency and increasing transmission power. Mustang lead, Mountain View Tower, you're breaking up. Switch to frequency 134.2 and try again. Only static answered him. Maria watched the electromagnetic readings on her equipment climb past the threshold where military radio systems typically began experiencing significant interference. The atmospheric disturbance was creating a phenomenon she'd encountered during desert operations, a communications black hole, where radio waves were scattered and absorbed by ionospheric turbulence. Brooks tried multiple frequencies, his voice becoming increasingly tense as each attempt failed to reach the squadron. Mustang lead, Mountain View Tower on guard frequency. How do you read? The emergency guard frequency, monitored by all military aircraft, remained silent except for the white noise of electromagnetic interference. 12 F-18 Super Hornets had effectively vanished from radio contact while still showing as radar targets on the air traffic control displays. What's happening to the radios? Brooks asked, his professional composure beginning to crack. The system was working fine 5 minutes ago. Maria stepped away from her console, knowing that this was the moment when her expertise would either be welcomed or dismissed. It's the atmospheric interference I warned you about. The storm front is creating ionospheric disturbance that's scattering radio waves across multiple frequency bands. Brooks frantically cycled through every available frequency, trying to establish contact with the squadron. His training had prepared him for equipment failures and routine communication problems, but not for atmospheric conditions that could silence an entire squadron simultaneously. Can we boost the transmission power? He asked, his hands moving across the control panel. Override the automatic systems? Higher power won't help, Maria explained, moving closer to his workstation. The interference is in the atmosphere itself. We're not dealing with weak signals, we're dealing with radio waves that are being scattered before they can reach the aircraft. Major Lisa Thompson, the operations officer, appeared at Brooks's shoulder with the tight expression of someone who realized a routine training mission was becoming something else entirely. Status report, Lieutenant. Where's my squadron? We've lost radio contact with all 12 aircraft, Brooks reported, his voice strained. Last transmission was 15 minutes ago. They're still showing on radar, but I can't reach them on any frequency. Thompson studied the radar display, watching the 12 bright dots that represented the F-18s continuing their westward course toward Mountain View Air Station. Their transponders are still working. Navigation systems must be functional. But Maria knew that transponders and GPS navigation systems were vulnerable to the same atmospheric interference affecting radio communications. The electromagnetic storm was just beginning to reach full intensity, and the squadron was flying deeper into conditions that would challenge every electronic system they carried. She approached Major Thompson with the professional bearing she'd maintained throughout her military career. "Ma'am, I've been tracking the atmospheric conditions that are causing the communication failure. The electromagnetic interference is going to get worse before it gets better." Thompson turned her attention to Maria for the first time since the crisis began. "You're the contractor working radio support?" "Yes, ma'am. 22 years Air Force communications, including multiple deployments where I dealt with similar atmospheric interference. This storm front is creating ionospheric disturbance that will affect GPS signals as well as radio communications." Thompson's expression shifted as she recognized that Maria might possess relevant expertise. "How long until communications are restored?" "Under normal circumstances, this type of interference can last for hours," Maria replied. "But there are alternative communication methods that aren't affected by ionospheric disturbance. Lower frequency systems that use ground wave propagation instead of sky wave reflection." Brooks looked up from his radio console with desperate hope. "Can we use those systems to contact the squadron?" "The F-18s aren't equipped with low-frequency radios," Maria explained. "But there are other options. High-frequency systems that can penetrate the interference if we use the right antenna configurations and frequency management techniques." The radar display showed the squadron maintaining their westward course, but Maria could see from the track spacing that individual aircraft were beginning to spread out. Without radio contact between the pilots, the precise formation discipline that had characterized the mission was starting to deteriorate. Major Thompson made a command decision that would prove crucial to the outcome of the crisis. "Maria, I'm authorizing you to use whatever equipment and frequencies necessary to re-establish contact with the squadron. Brooks, give her full access to the communication systems." It was the first time since arriving at Mountain View that Maria had been given authority to act on her expertise rather than simply observe. But as she moved toward the primary communication console, she realized that the standard Air Force radio equipment wasn't designed for the specialized techniques she would need to employ. "I need access to my own equipment," she told Thompson. "The older radio systems at my workstation have capabilities that the modern digital equipment doesn't include." Thompson nodded grimly. "Do whatever it takes." Maria returned to her corner console with a new sense of purpose, but also a growing understanding of the challenge she faced. The electromagnetic interference was intensifying as the storm front approached Mountain View Air Station, and the squadron was now flying through atmospheric conditions that were degrading every electronic system they carried. Her equipment showed electromagnetic readings that exceeded anything in her experience, with interference levels that would challenge even the most robust communication systems. But somewhere in the static-filled spectrum, there had to be frequencies that could penetrate the ionospheric disturbance and reach the squadron. The problem was that she had, perhaps 30 minutes before the F-18s reached the point where fuel considerations would force them to attempt landing approaches without radio guidance. 30 minutes to establish contact with 12 aircraft that had effectively vanished into an electromagnetic void. As Maria began the complex process of frequency analysis and antenna configuration, she could hear the growing tension in the voices around her. Controllers were trying unsuccessfully to contact other aircraft in the area, confirming that the communication blackout extended far beyond the training squadron. "All aircraft in the eastern Colorado area are affected," Brooks reported to Major Thompson. "We've lost contact with 2 civilian aircraft and a cargo flight that was inbound from Denver." The scope of the crisis was expanding, but Maria forced herself to focus on the immediate problem. 12 F-18 pilots were flying through an electromagnetic storm, without navigation aids or radio contact, depending on dead reckoning and visual references to find their way home. If the atmospheric interference continued to intensify, even their radar altimeters and instrument systems could be affected. She had the knowledge to solve this problem, but she would need to use techniques that hadn't been employed in operational situations for decades. Radio procedures that predated digital communications, frequency management methods that required intimate understanding of atmospheric physics, and antenna configurations that most modern operators had never seen. The old ways were about to become the only ways that worked. And Maria Vasquez was the only person at Mountain View Air Station who remembered how to make them work. The electromagnetic readings on Maria's console spiked beyond anything she'd seen in 2 decades of military communications. The storm front had accelerated to nearly twice its predicted speed, engulfing the entire eastern Colorado region in a blanket of ionospheric interference that was systematically disabling every electronic system within a 100-mile radius. At 11:45 hours, the situation escalated from communication failure to potential catastrophe when the squadron's radar transponders began disappearing from the air traffic control displays. One by one, the bright dots that represented 12 F-18 Super Hornets winked out as the electromagnetic interference overwhelmed even their most basic identification systems. "I've lost Cobra 3 and Cobra 4 on radar," Brooks announced, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Their transponders just went dark." Major Thompson leaned over the radar console, watching additional aircraft symbols fade from the screen. "How is that possible?" "Those transponders are designed to work in any atmospheric conditions." "Not these conditions," Maria replied, her hands moving across her frequency analysis equipment. "The electromagnetic interference is now strong enough to disrupt solid-state electronics. GPS systems, radar transponders, even basic radio receivers are being overwhelmed by atmospheric static." The implications hit Thompson immediately. Without radar contact, air traffic control had no way to track the squadron's position or monitor their separation from other aircraft. 12 F-18s were effectively flying blind through airspace that included civilian traffic, cargo flights, and military training aircraft from other bases. "Clear all aircraft from the eastern approach corridor," Thompson ordered. "I want a 50-mile exclusion zone around the squadron's last known position. And get me Colonel Richardson on the phone immediately." While Brooks coordinated the airspace clearance, Maria focused on the technical challenge of re-establishing communication with the lost squadron. Her older radio equipment included capabilities that had been eliminated from modern digital systems manually. Tunable frequency controls, variable antenna configurations, and analog signal processing that wasn't affected by the electromagnetic pulse effects disrupting computerized equipment. She began scanning frequency bands that weren't normally used for aviation communications, looking for atmospheric windows where radio waves might penetrate the ionospheric disturbance. It was painstaking work that required constant adjustment of frequency, power output, and antenna direction as atmospheric conditions shifted with the storm's movement. At 11:55 hours, she caught a fragment of transmission on a frequency normally reserved for maritime communications. Fuel state is critical. Navigation systems. The voice was barely audible through the static, but Maria recognized Captain Stone's distinctive transmission style. She fine-tuned the frequency and increased the gain on her receivers, trying to capture more of the squadron commander's transmission. Attempting to navigate by visual reference, Weather deteriorating, ... Maria keyed her microphone on the same frequency, knowing that her transmission might not reach the squadron, but hoping that atmospheric conditions would carry her signal further than the standard aviation frequencies. Mustang lead, this is Mountain View Radio on frequency 4.7-8-5. If you read this transmission, respond on this frequency. Static filled the channel for nearly a minute before a weak response emerged from the electromagnetic. Noise, Mountain View, this is Mustang lead. Barely reading you. GPS is down. Navigation systems, unreliable. The transmission was heavily distorted and intermittent, but it represented the first contact with the squadron in over 40 minutes. Maria felt a surge of professional satisfaction, but also a growing awareness of the crisis the pilots were facing. Mustang lead, understand GPS navigation is unreliable. What is your current fuel state and approximate position? The response took several minutes to arrive, coming in fragments as atmospheric interference allowed brief windows of communication. Fuel state. Approximately 45 minutes remaining. Position uncertain. Weather front blocking visual. REFERENCES. 45 minutes of fuel represented a critical emergency for 12 F-18s with no reliable navigation systems. Under normal circumstances, the flight time from the training area to Mountain View Air Station was less than 30 minutes. But without GPS guidance or radar vectors from air traffic control, the pilots were forced to navigate by dead reckoning and visual references that were being obscured by the approaching storm. Major Thompson appeared at Maria's console as she continued her efforts to maintain contact with the squadron. Can you guide them home on that frequency? It's intermittent at best, Maria replied, adjusting her antenna configuration. The atmospheric interference is creating communication windows that open and close unpredictably. I might have contact for a few minutes, then lose them completely for an hour. Colonel Richardson arrived in the control room with the tight expression of a commander who understood that a routine training mission had become a potential disaster. His silver hair was disheveled, and his uniform suggested he'd been pulled from another commitment to deal with the crisis. Status report, he demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having problems solved through proper command procedures. 12 F-18s lost in electromagnetic interference. Thompson replied, no radar contact, intermittent radio communication, and fuel state approaching critical levels. Maria has managed to establish limited contact using non-standard frequencies. Richardson looked at Maria with the calculating expression of a career officer evaluating an unexpected resource. You're the communications contractor? Yes, sir. Technical Sergeant Maria Vasquez, retired. 22 years, Air Force communications, including combat deployments dealing with similar atmospheric interference. Can you guide them home? Maria met his gaze with the professional confidence that had sustained her through 2 decades of military service. Sir, I can try. But the atmospheric conditions are unlike anything I've encountered. Standard navigation procedures won't work and radio contact is unreliable. I'll need to use techniques that aren't in current doctrine. Richardson nodded grimly. Do whatever it takes. Those pilots are running out of time and fuel. As if to emphasize the colonel's words, another fragment of transmission emerged from Maria's radio speakers. ... Fuel critical in 30 minutes. Need immediate vectors to any suitable airfield. The desperation in Captain Stone's voice was carefully controlled but unmistakable. 12 experienced pilots were flying through an electromagnetic nightmare, with diminishing fuel and no reliable way to navigate home. The sophisticated systems they depended on had been reduced to expensive ballast by atmospheric conditions that exceeded every design parameter. Maria made a decision that would define the rest of her career. She was going to abandon every standard procedure, and rely on techniques that hadn't been used operationally since before digital navigation existed. She would guide the squadron home using radio direction finding, atmospheric propagation analysis, and dead reckoning methods that predated satellite technology. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The clock on her console showed 12:05 hours. In 35 minutes, 12 F-18 Super Hornets would be forced to attempt emergency landings at unknown airfields with minimal fuel remaining. Unless the overlooked radio operator could perform a miracle using knowledge that everyone else had forgotten, the 7th Fighter Squadron was about to become a footnote in aviation disaster reports. Maria Vasquez adjusted her headset and began the most important conversation of her life. At 12:10 hours, Maria made a decision that violated every protocol in the Air Force Communications Manual. Instead of waiting for authorization from Colonel Richardson or coordinating through the established chain of command, she took direct control of the emergency frequency and began transmitting navigation instructions to 12 lost F-18s using techniques that hadn't appeared in official doctrine for 30 years. Mustang lead, Mountain View radio. I need you to turn to heading 310 and begin a gradual descent to 15,000 feet. Acknowledge if you copy. The response came through heavy static, Captain Stone's voice strained but professional. Mountain View radio, Mustang lead copies heading 310, descending to flight level 150. Be advised my GPS is completely unreliable and I have no radar vectors. Understood, Mustang lead. I'm going to guide you home using radio direction finding. I need you to transmit for 10 seconds on this frequency so I can get a bearing on your position. Maria's technique was based on principles that preceded satellite navigation by decades. By using multiple antenna arrays and analyzing the signal strength and direction of the squadron's transmissions, she could triangulate their approximate position and provide heading corrections to guide them toward Mountain View Air Station. But the process required constant adjustment for atmospheric interference, and the electromagnetic storm was creating propagation anomalies that could lead aircraft miles off course if the operator didn't compensate correctly. It was a technique that demanded intimate knowledge of radio wave physics and years of experience interpreting atmospheric effects on signal propagation. Lieutenant Brooks watched Maria work with growing amazement and concern. Should she be taking control of the frequency like that? Isn't there a protocol for this situation? Colonel Richardson silenced him with a sharp gesture. The protocol assumes we have working navigation systems and radar contact. Right now, she's the only one who can reach them. Maria adjusted her antenna array and analyzed the bearing information from Mustang lead's transmission. The signal indicated the squadron was approximately 60 miles east of Mountain View, but the atmospheric interference was creating bearing errors that could be significant. She compensated for the known propagation effects and calculated a corrected heading. Mustang lead, turn left to heading 290. Your current position is approximately 60 miles east of home base. Continue descent to 12,000 feet and maintain airspeed. Copying left turn to 290, descending to 12,000, Stone replied. Be advised weather is deteriorating rapidly. Visibility is less than 1 mile and decreasing. The squadron was flying into the leading edge of the storm front, where conventional weather effects compounded the electromagnetic interference. Visual navigation was becoming impossible, and their instrument systems were providing unreliable information due to the atmospheric disturbance. Maria realized she would need to guide each aircraft individually rather than relying on formation. Discipline to keep the squadron together. The electromagnetic interference was affecting radio communications between the COF and the F-18s as well as their contact with ground control. Mustang lead, I need you to have each flight check in separately. The interference is strong enough that you might not be able to communicate with each other reliably. Over the next 10 minutes, Maria established individual contact with Wolf Flight, Titan Flight, and Cobra Flight. Each four-ship formation was dealing with slightly different navigation challenges, as atmospheric conditions varied across their flight path. She began the complex process of providing separate heading and altitude instructions to each group while monitoring their progress toward Mountain View Air Station. Wolf Lead, turn right to heading 305 and descend to 10,000 feet. You're drifting south of course. Titan Lead, maintain current heading but increase airspeed to 450 knots. You're falling behind the other flights. Cobra Lead, turn left to heading 285. The atmospheric interference is stronger in your area, causing bearing drift. The technique was mentally exhausting, requiring Maria to maintain simultaneous awareness of 3 separate formations while constantly adjusting for atmospheric propagation effects. Each heading correction had to account for wind drift, electromagnetic interference patterns, and the unpredictable signal propagation characteristics created by the storm. Major Thompson stood behind Maria's console, monitoring the radio traffic, with growing respect for the complexity of what the veteran communicator was attempting. How are you tracking their positions without radar? Radio direction finding combined with time-distance calculations, Maria explained while continuing to transmit heading corrections. I'm using the signal strength and bearing of their transmissions to estimate position, then calculating course corrections based on their reported airspeed and elapsed time. It was a technique that required constant mental mathematics and deep understanding of radio wave propagation, skills that have been largely replaced by computerized navigation systems. But when those systems failed, the old methods remained the only reliable alternative. At 12:25 hours, Cobra Lead reported a critical fuel situation that escalated the emergency to a new level of urgency. Mountain View Radio, Cobra Lead, my number 3 aircraft is showing fuel critical. We need immediate vectors to the nearest suitable airfield. Maria checked her calculations and realized that Cobra Flight had drifted further off course than the other formations. They were now approximately 15 minutes further from Mountain View than Wolf and Titan flights, but their fuel state wouldn't allow them to complete the longer approach. She made a split-second decision that demonstrated both her technical expertise and her understanding of regional aviation infrastructure. Cobra Lead, turn right to heading 010 and descend to 8,000 feet. I'm vectoring you to Peterson Air Force Base. Distance approximately 35 miles. Runway heading 0-9-0. Cobra Lead copies heading 010, descending to 8,000. Confirm Peterson Air Force Base? Affirmative, Cobra Lead. Peterson has emergency services standing by and runway length suitable for F-18 operations. Continue present heading and I'll provide further guidance. The decision to divert Cobra Flight to Peterson demonstrated Maria's comprehensive knowledge of regional airfields and her ability to make tactical decisions under extreme pressure. By splitting the squadron and routing different flights to different airfields, she was maximizing the chances that all 12 aircraft would reach suitable landing sites before fuel exhaustion, but the technique also increased the complexity of her navigation challenge exponentially. She was now simultaneously guiding 8 F-18s toward Mountain View Air Station and 4 toward Peterson Air Force Base, using different radio frequencies and accounting for different atmospheric propagation patterns affecting each group. Colonel Richardson recognized the significance of what Maria was accomplishing. She's doing something that shouldn't be possible with the equipment we have available. As Maria continued her intricate dance of radio navigation, providing constant heading corrections and altitude guidance to pilots flying through electromagnetic chaos, she embodied everything that the military claimed to value: expertise, dedication, and the ability to improvise solutions when standard procedures failed. The overlooked radio operator was saving 12 lives using knowledge that others had forgotten, and skills that couldn't be replicated by digital systems. In the next 30 minutes, her ability to think beyond doctrine would determine whether the 7th Fighter Squadron made it home safely or became casualties of an atmospheric phenomenon that had overwhelmed every other system at Mountain View Air Station. The next 25 minutes represented the most technically demanding radio navigation sequence of Maria's career. Working with 3 separate radio systems simultaneously, she guided Wolf and Titan flights toward Mountain View Air Station while directing Cobra flight to Peterson Air Force Base, compensating for atmospheric interference that was constantly changing the propagation characteristics of every transmission dot. At 12:30 hours, Wolf lead reported visual contact with the ground through breaks in the cloud cover, but the landmarks below didn't match any recognizable features near Mountain View Air Station. Mountain View radio, Wolf lead. I can see the ground intermittently, but I'm not recognizing the terrain. Request confirmation of position. Maria analyzed the bearing and signal strength of Wolf lead's transmission, comparing it to her previous calculations and adjusting for the electromagnetic drift that was affecting radio direction. Finding accuracy. The atmospheric interference was creating bearing errors of up to 15 degrees, which could place aircraft miles off their intended course. Wolf lead, you're approximately 12 miles northeast of Mountain View Air Station. Turn left to heading 260 and continue descent to 6,000 feet. The terrain you're seeing should be the eastern edge of the Colorado Springs metropolitan area. Copying left turn to 260, descending to 6,000, Wolf lead replied. Fuel state is now critical. We need immediate approach clearance. Maria coordinated with Lieutenant Brooks to clear all traffic from Mountain View's approach corridors while simultaneously managing the navigation challenge of bringing Wolf flight home without radar guidance. The standard instrument landing system was functioning, but the pilots needed to be positioned accurately enough to acquire the approach signals through the electromagnetic interference. Wolf lead, you are 8 miles northeast of the field. Turn right to heading 280 and descend to 4,000 feet. You should intercept the ILS localizer in approximately 3 minutes. While guiding Wolf flight through their approach, Maria monitored Titan flight's progress on a second radio frequency. They were approximately 5 minutes behind Wolf flight, but following a similar course toward Mountain View Air Station. Titan lead, maintain heading 270 and current altitude. I'll have approach clearance for you immediately after Wolf flight lands. The challenge intensified when Cobra flight, approaching Peterson Air Force Base, reported navigation difficulties that threatened to exhaust their fuel before reaching the runway. Mountain View radio, Cobra lead, we're having trouble locating Peterson. Visibility is near zero and my navigation systems are providing conflicting information. Maria switched to her third radio system, the one dedicated to Cobra flight's approach to Peterson Air Force Base. She had to account for different atmospheric propagation patterns affecting the signal path to Peterson, while maintaining awareness of the approach sequences for the other 2 flights. Cobra lead, you are approximately 8 miles south of Peterson Air Force Base. Turn right to heading 350 and descend to 7,000 feet. Peterson approach control should be able to provide vectors once you're within 5 miles. But Peterson's approach controllers were experiencing the same communication difficulties that had plagued Mountain View. The electromagnetic interference was affecting all radio communications across the Colorado region, forcing Maria to maintain navigation control for Cobra flight even as they approached another airfield. Cobra lead, Peterson approach. Control is experiencing communication difficulties. I'll continue to provide vectors until you have visual contact with the runway. At 12:40 hours, Wolf lead's voice crackled through the static with the first piece of good news in over an hour. Mountain View radio, Wolf lead has the runway in sight. Requesting clearance for emergency approach. Wolf lead, you are cleared for emergency approach runway 27. Emergency vehicles are standing by. Contact tower on frequency 118.1. Maria watched Wolf flights approach through the control room windows. 4 F-18 Super Hornets emerging from the low clouds in tight formation before separating for individual landings. The sight of the first aircraft touching down safely represented a partial victory, but 8 more F-18s remained airborne with critically low fuel states. Titan flight's approach proceeded more smoothly, benefiting from the navigation techniques Maria had refined during Wolf flight's arrival. Titan lead, you are 5 miles northeast of Mountain View. Turn right to heading 290 and descend to 3,000 feet. You should have visual contact with the runway approach lights in 2 minutes. Titan lead has the approach lights in sight, came the reply. Requesting immediate clearance for emergency approach. Titan lead, cleared for emergency approach. Runway 27. Wolf flight is clear of the runway and taxiing to parking. As Titan flight touched down safely at Mountain View, Maria concentrated her full attention on Cobra flight's critical approach to Peterson Air Force Base. Their fuel situation had deteriorated to the point where a missed approach could result in aircraft loss. Cobra lead, you are 3 miles south of Peterson Air Force Base. Turn right to heading 010 and descend to 5,000 feet. The runway should be visible directly ahead. Cobra lead, I have intermittent visual contact with what might be runway lights. Fuel is at emergency levels. We need immediate clearance. Maria coordinated directly with Peterson's emergency services, bypassing the communication difficulties affecting their approach controllers. Cobra lead, you are cleared for emergency approach Peterson Air Force Base runway 09. Emergency. Vehicles are positioned and ready. The final minutes of Cobra flight's approach tested every aspect of Maria's radio navigation expertise. Atmospheric interference was creating bearing errors that could place the aircraft off the runway centerline, and their fuel state left no margin for error. Cobra lead, you are drifting left of centerline. Turn right 5 degrees and maintain current altitude until you have positive visual contact with the runway. Cobra 3 is declaring fuel emergency, came an urgent transmission. We're not sure we can make the field. Maria made a split-second calculation based on distance, fuel consumption, and atmospheric conditions. Cobra 3, maintain current heading and altitude. You are 2 miles from touchdown. Peterson emergency services are ready for any contingency. At 12:52 hours, Cobra lead's voice confirmed the successful conclusion of the most challenging radio navigation sequence in Maria's career. Peterson Tower, Cobra lead on the ground. All 4 aircraft safely recovered. The control room erupted in subdued celebration as the realization sank in that all 12 F-18s had been successfully guided to safe landings despite complete failure of their primary navigation systems. Maria had accomplished something that shouldn't have been possible using radio equipment that was considered obsolete by modern standards. Colonel Richardson approached her console with an expression that combined relief, amazement, and professional respect. Outstanding work, Sergeant. That was the most impressive display of radio navigation I've ever witnessed. But Maria's response was characteristic of the professional humility that had defined her military career. Just doing my job, sir, getting our people home safely. As she powered down her radio equipment and began documenting the frequencies and techniques she'd used, Maria reflected on the transformation that had occurred during the past 3 hours. She was no longer the invisible contractor relegated to routine tasks. She had proven that expertise and experience could triumph over sophisticated technology when atmospheric conditions exceeded design parameters. The 12 pilots of the 7th Fighter Squadron owed their lives to knowledge that had nearly been forgotten and skills that couldn't be replicated by digital systems. And the overlooked radio operator who had saved them all was about to discover that visibility, once earned through competence under pressure, could never be taken away. The electromagnetic storm that had terrorized the Colorado airspace for 3 hours began to dissipate as quickly as it had formed, leaving behind clear skies and the stunned silence of people who had witnessed something extraordinary. At 1300 hours, normal radio communications resumed across the region, but the crisis had already been resolved through methods that predated modern aviation technology by decades. Maria sat at her console in the sudden quiet, her hands still trembling, slightly from the adrenaline of the past hour. The 3 radio systems she had used to guide the squadron home were powered down now, their analog dials and manual controls looking primitive compared to the digital displays that surrounded them. But those obsolete systems had accomplished what the most advanced navigation technology could not. They had brought 12 lost F-18s safely home through an electromagnetic nightmare. Colonel Richardson stood behind her chair, studying the handwritten notes she had used to track each aircraft's position and fuel state. The calculations covered 3 pages of notebook paper, filled with bearing corrections, time-distance computations, and atmospheric interference adjustments that represented the most complex radio navigation sequence he had ever witnessed. "I need to understand exactly what you did," he said, his voice carrying genuine respect for technical expertise he was only beginning to comprehend. "The debriefing team is going to want documentation of every procedure you used." Maria turned in her chair to face him, her professional composure returning as the immediate crisis passed. "Sir, I used radio direction finding combined with triangulation techniques to establish approximate positions for each flight. Then I applied atmospheric propagation corrections to compensate for electromagnetic interference affecting the bearing accuracy. In terms that a non-communications specialist can understand," Richardson requested. "I used the direction and strength of their radio signals to figure out where they were, then guided them home using compass headings and distance calculations. The atmospheric interference was bending radio waves, so I had to adjust for that distortion to keep them on course." Lieutenant Brooks approached the group with a computer printout showing the squadron's actual flight path as recorded by distant radar stations that had maintained intermittent contact during the crisis. The track showed how close the aircraft had come to disaster, with several flights deviating more than 40 miles from their intended course before Maria's navigation guidance brought them back on track. According to this data, Cobra flight was heading directly toward restricted airspace when you vectored them to Peterson, Brooks said, his voice reflecting new understanding of how critical Maria's intervention had been. "Without your guidance, they could have ended up over the Colorado Springs Missile Defense Complex." The implications were sobering. 12 F-18s, with no navigation systems and critically low fuel, could have created a national security incident if they had strayed into restricted airspace or attempted emergency landings at civilian airports unprepared for military aircraft. Maria's decision to split the squadron and route different flights to appropriate military airfields had prevented multiple potential disasters. Major Thompson joined the growing group around Maria's workstation, carrying a secure phone that indicated she had been coordinating with higher command levels during the crisis. "I just finished briefing General Morrison at Cheyenne Mountain. He wants a complete technical analysis of what happened here today. The atmospheric interference was unlike anything in our experience," Maria replied. "The electromagnetic readings exceeded the design parameters for every navigation system the F-18s carry. Standard communication protocols were completely ineffective. But your methods worked," Thompson observed. "How is that possible when billion-dollar navigation systems failed?" Maria gestured toward her analog radio equipment. "It's mechanical. Controls and vacuum tube amplifiers looking like museum pieces compared to the computerized systems around them. Digital systems are vulnerable to electromagnetic pulse effects and ionospheric interference. Analog equipment processes signals differently, using principles that aren't affected by the same atmospheric disturbances. The explanation highlighted a fundamental issue in modern military aviation: the increasing dependence on digital technology that, while more capable under normal conditions, could be completely defeated by electromagnetic warfare or extreme atmospheric phenomena. Maria's success demonstrated the continuing value of older technologies and the expertise required to operate them effectively. At 13:15 hours, the first direct contact from the rescued pilots came through the restored communication systems. Captain Stone's voice carried a mixture of professional gratitude and personal recognition that Maria had never heard directed toward her before. Mountain View Radio. This is Mustang Lead on the ground at Mountain View. On behalf of the entire 7th Fighter Squadron, I want to express our appreciation for the outstanding navigation assistance that brought us home safely. Maria keyed her microphone with the same professional demeanor she had maintained throughout the crisis. Mustang Lead, Mountain View Radio. Glad we could help. Hope everyone made it down safely. All 12 aircraft recovered without incident. Stone replied, "Your navigation guidance was flawless under impossible conditions. We'd like to thank you personally when we complete our post-flight procedures." The formal acknowledgement from Captain Stone represented something unprecedented in Maria's experience at Mountain View Air Station. For the first time since her arrival, a senior officer was recognizing her contribution by name rather than dismissing her as anonymous support personnel. Similar recognition came from Peterson Air Force Base, where Cobra flight had landed with fuel reserves measured in single-digit minutes. The Peterson approach controller, who had witnessed Maria's navigation of Cobra flight through the electromagnetic interference, transmitted his own professional appreciation. Mountain View Radio, Peterson approach. Outstanding work on the Cobra. Flight recovery. That navigation sequence was textbook perfect under conditions where textbook procedures don't exist. Colonel Richardson documented each acknowledgement as part of the official record, recognizing that Maria's performance during the crisis would require formal recognition through military channels. The contrast with her previous invisibility was striking. From overlooked contractor to mission-critical specialist in the span of 3 hours. As normal operations resumed throughout the Colorado airspace, Maria began the process of documenting the techniques and procedures she had used during the emergency. The information would be crucial for updating communication protocols and training programs to address similar atmospheric interference in the future. But the most significant change wasn't in the procedures or technology. It was in how people at Mountain View Air Station now viewed the quiet veteran who had worked in the corner console for 8 months without recognition. The electromagnetic storm had revealed expertise that had been hidden in plain sight, capabilities that couldn't be measured by organizational charts or job descriptions. Lieutenant Brooks, who had dismissed her atmospheric warnings just hours earlier, approached her console with an expression combining professional respect and personal embarrassment. "Maria, I owe you an apology. You tried to warn us about the communication problems, and I didn't listen." "No apology necessary," Maria replied, her voice carrying the same steady professionalism that had characterized her radio transmissions. During the crisis, we all did our jobs today. But they both knew that Maria had done much more than her assigned job. She had used knowledge that others didn't possess, applied techniques that others couldn't replicate, and made decisions that others weren't qualified to make. The invisible contractor had become the most visible person at Mountain View Air Station, not through self-promotion or political maneuvering, but through competence demonstrated under the most demanding conditions possible. As the afternoon sun streamed through the control room windows, highlighting the analog radio equipment that had proven more valuable than digital navigation systems costing millions of dollars, Maria Vasquez began to understand that her career had taken a permanent turn. The expertise that had been overlooked for 8 months was now recognized as mission-critical capability that could not be ignored or undervalued. The electromagnetic storm had passed, but its effects on Maria's life were just beginning. 3 days after the electromagnetic storm, Maria walked into the Mountain View Air Station Communication Center to find her workstation had been relocated to the center of the room. Her analog radio equipment, once relegated to the corner like obsolete machinery, now occupied a position of prominence beside the primary air traffic control console. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone who worked in the facility. Colonel Richardson had requested a formal debriefing session at 0800 hours, but this time Maria received a written invitation rather than learning about the meeting through overheard conversations. The conference room that had excluded her for 8 months now welcomed her as the primary subject matter expert on atmospheric communication techniques. The assembled group included not only the local command staff, but also technical specialists from Cheyenne Mountain and communications experts from the Air Force Academy. Word of the electromagnetic storm incident had traveled through military channels, generating interest from organizations that dealt with communication challenges in hostile environments. Sergeant Vasquez, Colonel Richardson began using her military rank for the first time since her arrival at Mountain View. Your actions during the electromagnetic storm represent the most significant example of individual initiative and technical expertise I've encountered in my career. I want you to walk us through exactly how you managed to guide 12 F-18s to safety when our primary systems failed. Maria stood at the head of the conference table, a position she had never occupied during her time as a contractor. The technical presentation she had prepared covered atmospheric radio propagation, frequency management under interference conditions, and the radio direction finding techniques that had enabled her to navigate the squadron through the electromagnetic chaos. The key factor was understanding that digital navigation systems are vulnerable to electromagnetic pulse effects that don't affect analog radio equipment the same way. She explained, using diagrams to illustrate the propagation patterns that had guided her navigation decisions. By switching to lower frequency bands and using manual antenna configurations, I could establish communication windows that penetrated the atmospheric interference. Captain Stone, who had attended the briefing at Colonel Richardson's request, provided the pilot's perspective on the emergency. From our standpoint, Sergeant Vasquez's navigation guidance was the only reliable information we had during the entire approach sequence. Our GPS systems were providing position errors of up to 20 miles, and our radio communications with each other were completely unreliable. The heading corrections were precise enough that we never felt lost or disoriented, added Lieutenant Commander Ryan Brooks, who had flown as Wolf 3 during the mission. Even though we couldn't see the ground or trust our instruments, we knew exactly where we were going based on her guidance. The technical analysis that followed Maria's presentation revealed the full scope of what she had accomplished. Dr. Sarah Mitchell from the Air Force Academy's Atmospheric Sciences Department had studied the electromagnetic data recorded during the storm, confirming that the interference levels had exceeded the design parameters for every digital navigation system in the military inventory. The ionospheric disturbance created electromagnetic conditions equivalent to a limited nuclear electromagnetic pulse, Dr. Mitchell explained. Under those conditions, satellite navigation becomes unreliable and digital communication systems experience cascading failures. Sergeant Vasquez used techniques that weren't affected by those conditions because they operate on completely different principles. Major Thompson, who had witnessed Maria's performance during the crisis, addressed the broader implications for military communication doctrine. This incident demonstrates that we've become overly dependent on digital systems without maintaining proficiency in backup procedures. If Sergeant Vasquez hadn't been available, we could have lost 12 aircraft and pilots. The discussion that followed centered on the need to preserve and expand expertise in atmospheric communication techniques. Maria's knowledge represented institutional memory that was disappearing as older veterans retired and younger personnel focused exclusively on digital technologies. I'm recommending that Sergeant Vasquez be assigned to develop a training program in alternative communication methods, Colonel Richardson announced. Her expertise needs to be transferred to our current communication specialists before it's lost entirely. The formal recognition continued beyond the debriefing session. Maria's personnel file was updated to reflect her new status as a subject matter expert in atmospheric communications, and her contractor position was converted to a permanent civilian specialist role with significantly increased responsibilities and compensation. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the pilots she had guided home. Captain Stone presented Maria with a squadron patch signed by all 12 members of the 7th Fighter Squadron, along with a personal letter expressing their gratitude for her life-saving navigation assistance. "You brought us home when nobody else could," Stone said during the informal presentation. "That makes you part of our squadron family." The transformation in how Maria was perceived by her colleagues was complete and irreversible. Conversations no longer stopped when she entered a room. Instead, people sought her input on technical matters related to communication systems and atmospheric interference. Her expertise was consulted rather than ignored, and her opinions carried the weight of proven competence under pressure. Lieutenant Brooks, who had initially dismissed her atmospheric warnings, became one of her strongest advocates for expanding the alternative communication training program. "I learned more about radio navigation in 3 hours watching Maria work than I did in 4 years of college," he admitted. "We need to make sure that knowledge doesn't walk out the door when she retires." The change extended beyond professional recognition to personal relationships within the military community. Maria was invited to social gatherings she had previously been excluded from, included in professional discussions that had once been closed to contractor personnel, and treated with the respect accorded to someone whose expertise had proven essential under crisis conditions. 3 weeks after the electromagnetic storm, Maria received notification that she had been selected for the Air Force Association's Outstanding Civilian Service Award, recognizing her exceptional contribution to mission success and aircrew safety. The citation specifically mentioned her innovative application of atmospheric communication techniques that enabled the safe recovery of 12 F-18 aircraft during electromagnetic interference that defeated all standard navigation systems. The award ceremony took place in the same conference room where Maria had been excluded from mission briefings just months earlier. This time, she stood at the podium as the guest of honor, surrounded by the pilots whose lives she had saved, and the colleagues who now recognized her true value to the organization. Technical Sergeant Maria Vasquez represents the best of military professionalism, Colonel Richardson said during his presentation remarks. Her willingness to act on specialized knowledge, combined with her technical competence under extreme pressure, exemplifies the expertise and dedication that make our mission possible. But for Maria, the most significant aspect of the recognition wasn't the formal awards or professional advancement. It was the knowledge that her expertise was now valued and preserved, ensuring that future generations of military communicators would understand the techniques that had saved 12 lives during an ANPM electromagnetic storm. The invisible contractor had become a visible expert, not through political maneuvering or self-promotion, but through competence demonstrated when everything else failed. Her transformation was complete, but her impact on military communication doctrine was just beginning. 6 months after the electromagnetic storm, Maria stood before a classroom of 24 Air Force communication specialists, teaching techniques that had been considered obsolete until 12 F-18 pilots owed their lives to knowledge that predated digital technology. Her new position as chief instructor for alternative communication methods represented the institutionalization of expertise that had once been dismissed as irrelevant to modern military operations. The Mountain View Air Station Advanced Communication Training Center occupied a building that had been hastily constructed to house the program Maria had developed from her electromagnetic storm experience. The facility contained both modern digital equipment and carefully maintained analog radio systems, representing the marriage of current technology with proven backup procedures that could function when sophisticated systems failed. The fundamental principle of atmospheric communication, Maria explained to her students, is understanding that radio waves are affected by conditions in the ionosphere that can't be predicted by standard meteorological forecasting. When digital systems fail, analog techniques provide alternatives that operate on completely different principles. Her students included experienced communication specialists from bases across the western United States, officers who had volunteered for training that their careers had never required, but that recent events had proven essential. The electromagnetic storm incident had generated military-wide interest in communication redundancy and alternative navigation techniques. Lieutenant Sarah Kim, a recent Academy graduate with a degree in electronic engineering, raised her hand during the atmospheric propagation lecture. "Ma'am, how do you compensate for bearing errors when you can't rely on computerized direction-finding systems?" Maria smiled at the question, remembering her own confusion when she had first encountered manual radio direction finding techniques during her early military training. "You use multiple bearing measurements taken over time, cross-referenced, with known landmarks and adjusted for atmospheric propagation effects. It requires constant mental calculation, but it provides navigation accuracy that isn't affected by electromagnetic interference." The training program Maria had developed covered everything from basic atmospheric physics to advanced frequency management techniques. Students learned to operate analog radio equipment that had been retrieved from storage warehouses, mastering controls and procedures that hadn't been taught in military schools for decades. But the most challenging aspect of the training wasn't technical, it was psychological. Students had to overcome their dependence on digital systems and learn to trust calculations performed mentally rather than by computer. The skills required patience, practice, and the kind of intuitive understanding that could only be developed through extensive hands-on experience. "The hardest part," explained Sergeant David Chun, a communications specialist from Nellis Air Force Base, "is learning to work without the constant feedback that digital systems provide. You have to trust your calculations and atmospheric analysis, even when you can't verify your results electronically." Maria's response reflected the confidence that had carried her through the electromagnetic storm crisis. Trust develops through practice and understanding. When you comprehend why the techniques work, you gain confidence in applying them under pressure. The training program's reputation had spread beyond the Air Force to other military services, facing similar challenges with communication redundancy. Navy communication specialists attended courses on shipboard atmospheric communication, while Army personnel learned techniques for maintaining contact in electronic warfare environments. Colonel Richardson, who had been promoted to brigadier general based partly on his recognition of Maria's capabilities, visited the training center regularly to monitor the program's development. His support had been crucial in securing funding and resources for the facility, but his continued involvement reflected genuine appreciation for the expertise Maria brought to military communication doctrine. "This program addresses a critical vulnerability in our communication systems," General Richardson explained during a visit from Pentagon communication specialists. The electromagnetic storm incident demonstrated that sophisticated technology can be defeated by atmospheric conditions that our people weren't trained to handle. The training center's influence extended beyond individual skill development to broader changes in military communication policy. New regulations required communication specialists to maintain proficiency in analog backup systems and equipment procurement specifications included requirements for analog redundancy in digital communication suites. Maria's role expanded beyond teaching to include consultation on communication system design and atmospheric research coordination with civilian scientific institutions. Her expertise was now recognized at the highest levels of military communication planning, and her input was sought on everything from satellite communication, vulnerability, to electronic warfare, countermeasures. The transformation in her professional status was reflected in the respect accorded to her opinions during high-level briefings. When communication challenges arose during military exercises or real-world operations, Maria's assessment was considered essential rather than supplementary. Captain Stone, now promoted to major and serving as operations officer for a different squadron, visited the training center to observe the program that had grown from her rescue experience. Her perspective on the electromagnetic storm incident had evolved as she gained a deeper understanding of the technical challenges Maria had overcome. "I didn't realize at the time how complex the navigation sequence was," Stone admitted during her visit. "We just followed the heading corrections and trusted that Maria knew what she was doing. Now I understand that she was performing calculations that would challenge teams of specialists under normal conditions." The electromagnetic storm incident had become a case study taught at military academies and staff colleges, but Maria ensured that the lessons learned extended beyond academic discussion to practical skill development. Her students graduated with capabilities that previous generations of communication specialists had never possessed, combining modern technology expertise with alternative techniques that could function when digital systems failed. The training program's success was measured not only in student proficiency, but in the prevention of communication failures during subsequent atmospheric disturbances. When another electromagnetic storm struck the Pacific Northwest 18 months later, communication specialists trained in Maria's techniques maintained contact with aircraft that would otherwise have been lost to atmospheric interference. The program has eliminated our vulnerability to atmospheric communication disruption, reported Colonel James Walsh from McCord Air Force Base after successfully managing aircraft operations during severe ionospheric interference. "Our people knew exactly what to do when digital systems started failing." But perhaps the most significant measure of Maria's impact was the institutional preservation of knowledge that had almost been lost. The techniques that had saved 12 F-18 pilots were now documented, taught, and practiced by hundreds of communication specialists across the military. Expertise that had existed in the memory of a few veterans was now embedded in official doctrine and training curricula. As Maria concluded another day of instruction at the PAVA Advanced Communication Training Center, she reflected on the journey from overlooked contractor to recognized expert. The electromagnetic storm had revealed capabilities that others hadn't known existed, but the real transformation had been in the military's willingness to value expertise regardless of its source. Students filed out of the classroom carrying knowledge that could save lives when sophisticated technology failed. And Maria knew that her most important contribution wasn't the technique she had used during the electromagnetic storm. It was ensuring that others could replicate her success when future crises demanded solutions that couldn't be found in digital systems. The invisible radio operator had become a teacher, a mentor, and a guardian of knowledge that would outlive her career and protect future generations of military personnel who might face challenges that exceeded the capabilities of their primary systems. 3 years after the electromagnetic storm that changed everything, Maria Vasquez stood on the observation deck of the newly constructed Regional Communication Emergency Response Center, watching as teams of specialists managed a crisis that would have been unthinkable before her intervention transformed military communication doctrine. Below, in the state-of-the-art facility that bore her name, technicians trained in both digital and analog communication techniques guided aircraft through another Atmospheric disturbance with the calm competence that came from understanding. Multiple approaches to complex problems. The Maria Vasquez Communication Training Center had become the model for similar facilities across the military, each one staffed by specialists who had learned that technological sophistication meant nothing without the human expertise to apply alternative solutions when primary systems failed. Her techniques were now standard curriculum at every military communication school, and her approach to problem-solving under pressure had influenced training programs far beyond the field of radio operations. On this particular morning, the crisis unfolding in the Colorado airspace was more severe than the electromagnetic storm that had launched Maria's transformation from overlooked contractor to internationally recognized expert. A solar flare had created ionospheric disturbance across the entire western United States, affecting not only military communications but civilian aviation, emergency services, and commercial satellite systems, but the response was dramatically different from the chaos that had characterized the original incident. Teams of communication specialists, trained in the techniques Maria had developed and refined, established alternative communication networks within minutes of the first system failures. Aircraft diverted to appropriate airfields using radio navigation methods that had been preserved and improved through 3 years of practical application. All aircraft in the Denver area are being successfully guided to safe landings using backup communication protocols, reported Colonel Lisa Park, the center's current director and one of Maria's first advanced students. We have full communication coverage despite complete GPS failure across the region. Maria watched the operation with quiet satisfaction, knowing that the expertise she had preserved was now protecting hundreds of lives rather than the 12 F-18 pilots whose rescue had started everything. The techniques that had seemed obsolete just years earlier were now considered essential redundancy for any sophisticated communication system. General Richardson, now serving as Deputy Chief of Staff for Communications at the Pentagon, had traveled to Colorado to observe the center's response to the solar flare emergency. His presence reflected the high-level attention that Maria's work continued to receive from military leadership who understood that technological advancement meant nothing without human expertise to apply it effectively. This response demonstrates the value of maintaining proficiency in alternative techniques, General Richardson told the gathered observers. When primary systems fail, we need people who can think beyond standard procedures and apply solutions that work under any conditions. Center's capabilities extended far beyond the military applications that had inspired its creation. Civilian emergency services, commercial aviation, and even international rescue organizations had adopted communication techniques developed from Maria's electromagnetic storm experience. Her influence had spread throughout the global aviation community, creating redundancy that protected lives across multiple sectors. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Maria's legacy wasn't technical, it was cultural. The military had learned to value expertise regardless of its source, to recognize that knowledge could exist in unexpected places, and to understand that hierarchical thinking could blind organizations to capabilities that existed within their own ranks. Captain Emma Stone, now a full colonel commanding her own wing, visited the center regularly to speak with new students about the electromagnetic storm incident from the pilot's perspective. Her account had become part of the standard curriculum, emphasizing how technical expertise could overcome seemingly impossible challenges when applied by someone with the courage to act outside established procedures. Sergeant Vasquez saved our lives by doing something that wasn't in any manual, Colonel Stone would tell each new class. She saw a problem that others couldn't solve and applied knowledge that others didn't possess. That's the kind of thinking that separates competent technicians from true professionals. The stories of Maria's students had become legends within the military communication community. Specialists who had learned her techniques were credited with preventing aircraft disasters, maintaining communication during natural disasters, and solving complex technical problems that had defeated teams of engineers. The ripple effects of her expertise continued to expand, protecting lives and preventing crises years after the original incident. Dr. Sarah Mitchell from the Air Force Academy had documented the scientific principles underlying Maria's atmospheric communication techniques, turning practical knowledge into theoretical frameworks that could be taught and replicated systematically. The research had contributed to advances in atmospheric physics and communication theory that extended far beyond military applications. Sergeant Vasquez's intuitive understanding of atmospheric radio propagation has led to discoveries about ionospheric behavior that we're still exploring. Dr. Mitchell explained during a symposium on atmospheric communication. Her practical techniques opened research directions that pure theoretical work had never considered. As the solar flare emergency concluded with 0 aircraft losses and minimal communication disruption, Maria reflected on the journey that had transformed her from an invisible contractor to a recognized expert whose influence extended throughout the military and beyond. The change hadn't come through self-promotion or political maneuvering, but through competence demonstrated when everything else failed. The center that bore her name would continue operating long after her retirement, staffed by specialists who understood that true expertise meant more than following procedures. It meant having the knowledge and courage to create new solutions when existing methods proved inadequate. Her techniques would evolve and improve, but the fundamental lesson would remain: that valuable expertise often existed in unexpected places, waiting for the right crisis to reveal its importance. Standing on the observation deck as normal operations resumed throughout the Colorado airspace, Maria understood that her greatest achievement wasn't saving 12 F-18 pilots during an electromagnetic storm. It was proving that competence and dedication could overcome any obstacle, that quiet expertise could be more valuable than loud authority, and that one person with the right knowledge and the courage to act could change everything. The invisible radio operator had become visible not by demanding attention, but by earning it through results that spoke louder than rank or title. Her legacy would live on in every communication specialist who understood that technology was only as good as the human expertise needed to apply it. When conventional solutions failed, Maria Vasquez had learned the most important lesson of all: that true authority came not from position or recognition, but from the ability to solve problems that others couldn't handle and the willingness to act when action was needed, regardless of whether anyone was watching or keeping score. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.